Welcome back, everyone. Today we're traveling back in time to ancient Egypt, one of history's most captivating civilizations.
And one that lasted an incredibly long time.
Longer than most people realize, right?
Absolutely. We're talking roughly 3150 BC to 30 BC, so over 3,000 years. Think about everything that happened during that time.
It's mind-boggling. I have a stack of research here. Ancient texts, archaeology reports, even some modern analysis. Where should we even begin? What jumps out at you from all this material?
Honestly, the impact of the Nile River, like on every single aspect of ancient Egyptian life, it's amazing. It wasn't just water, it was fundamental to their entire success.
Okay, that's a good place to start. We all know the Nile's important, but how was it so special for them?
Well, the flooding was incredibly predictable, unlike so many other rivers. Every year, like clockwork, the Nile would overflow its banks, and when it did, it would leave behind this layer of nutrient-rich silt. It was like nature was delivering fertilizer right to their doorstep.
So it wasn't just giving them water, it was replenishing the soil for their crops, too.
Exactly. This annual flood and the fertile silt that came with it allowed the Egyptians to produce way more food than they needed. And you know what a surplus like that means.
It means people have time to do more than just survive. It means specialization, right?
You got it. When you're not constantly worried about where your next meal is coming from, you can develop other skills. You get artisans, scribes, priests, and a much more complex society as a result. It was a major factor in ancient Egypt's success.
Which brings us to something I found really interesting. A lot of this research goes beyond the typical pyramids and pharaohs story. We're getting into the details of their society.
Absolutely. Ancient Egypt was far more than just powerful rulers. I mean, it had this complex web of social classes. You had farmers, of course, the backbone of any agricultural society. Then you had artisans crafting everything from pottery to incredible jewelry. And scribes, they held a super crucial position. They were responsible for record keeping and administration.
The ancient world's bureaucrats.
Haha. Yeah, you could say that. But don't underestimate their importance. Scribes were highly educated and respected people. They held real power in how the state functioned.
What about the legal system? Was it all just the pharaoh calling the shots?
It wasn't, actually. The sources highlight a legal system that was surprisingly egalitarian for the time. Even peasants could petition for justice and bring their case before the courts.
Wow, I wouldn't have expected that.
It really challenges our assumptions about the past, doesn't it? Ancient Egypt was much more nuanced than we sometimes give it credit for.
Speaking of challenging assumptions, I was really struck by the information on women's rights in ancient Egypt. It seems they had a lot more freedom and agency than in many other ancient cultures.
Absolutely. Egyptian women had property rights, they could initiate divorce, and they could even hold positions of power. The most famous example, of course, is Hatshepsut, who ruled as pharaoh. And that wasn't just a fluke. It reflects a broader societal view that recognized women's capabilities.
Okay, now I'm really intrigued. We've talked about the big picture, but I want to know what daily life was actually like. I mean, what did they eat? Where did they live? What did they do for fun?
Well, based on what we've got here, it seems most homes, even for the wealthy, were relatively simple. Mud brick was the go-to building material. It kept things cool in that hot climate. And they were big on hygiene, bathing regularly in the Nile. For leisure, music, dancing, and board games were popular. Imagine a warm evening playing a game of Senet with your family under the stars.
Sounds pretty idyllic. One of our sources mentions a workers' village called Deir el Medina.
Ah, yeah, Deir el Medina is amazing. It gives us a super detailed glimpse into daily life. The records kept by the workers who live there, they give us a unique window into their world, their social interactions, their work, their families. It's like a time capsule.
And speaking of glimpses into the past, I have to say I was blown away by the Edwin Smith Papyrus. That ancient medical text is incredible.
It really is. It reveals a practical and surprisingly effective medical system. They used honey for infections, which we know today has antibacterial properties. They even had a treatment for burns that involved using milk.
Milk, really? And it worked.
Well, according to the sources, milk contains compounds that can help soothe and heal burns, so yeah, there might be something to it.
Hold on, we also have information about their shipbuilding. Apparently, they had some of the oldest known planked ships, the Abydos boats, dating back to 3000 BC.
That's right. And these boats were constructed with planks that were sewn together using woven straps, and then they were sealed with reeds. This level of shipbuilding sophistication at such an early date is remarkable. It shows just how advanced they were technologically.
Which reinforces the point that ancient Egypt was far more than just pyramids. Their technological expertise extended to many areas.
Absolutely. Take their math knowledge, for instance. They used fractions, calculated complex areas and volumes, and even understood the Pythagorean theorem all before Pythagoras.
Before Pythagoras. Wow, that's amazing.
They were master builders, skilled mathematicians, and innovative engineers. It's a reminder to never underestimate the achievements of past civilizations.
And they weren't isolated either. The research we have details their interactions with other cultures.
Right. They traded with other civilizations, often for essential resources like timber and lapis lazuli, things they didn't have in Egypt. Of course, there were also conflicts, like the invasion by the Hyksos, which had a major impact on their history.
Okay, the Hyksos. That's ringing a bell. Can you remind me who they were?
They were a group from West Asia, possibly from the Levant region, who migrated to Egypt and eventually gained control of a significant portion of the country.
So they weren't just raiders. They actually ruled part of Egypt.
Exactly. They even established their own dynasty, the 15th dynasty, ruling over Lower Egypt for about a century. It was a turbulent period in Egyptian history, a time of upheaval and change.
What was it like for the Egyptians under Hyksos rule? Did they adopt Hyksos customs, or was there resistance?
Oh, there was definitely resistance, especially in Upper Egypt, where the native Egyptian rulers held on to power. But the Hyksos, to their credit, weren't just conquerors, they were also adapters.
What do you mean?
Well, they adopted many Egyptian customs, including their religious beliefs and artistic styles. They even took on Egyptian names and titles. In a way, they tried to legitimize their rule by presenting themselves as pharaohs, even though they weren't native Egyptians.
So it was a blend of cultures, a bit of give and take.
Yeah, it was. And it's important to remember that history is rarely a simple story of good guys and bad guys. The Hyksos invasion, while certainly disruptive, also had some lasting impacts on Egyptian culture and technology.
Now you've got me curious about those impacts. What did the Hyksos introduce that changed Egypt?
They introduced new military technologies like the composite bow and the horse-drawn chariot. These innovations gave them a tactical advantage, and the Egyptians had to adapt to stay in the game.
So they had to step up their game to reclaim their territory.
Exactly, and that's precisely what they did. The period following the Hyksos expulsion, known as the New Kingdom, saw a resurgence of Egyptian power and military strength.
And some pretty iconic pharaohs too, right? Tutankhamun, Ramesses the Great. Those names were legendary.
Absolutely. The New Kingdom was an era of ambitious building projects, expanding empires, and great pharaohs. Tutankhamun might be the most famous because his tomb was discovered relatively intact, but Ramesses II was a total powerhouse. He ruled for over 60 years and left behind a legacy of colossal statues and incredible temples.
Okay, but even with all this power and expansion, are there any hiccups along the way?
Well, there are always challenges. One really interesting period is the reign of Akhenaten, a pharaoh who tried to revolutionize Egyptian religion.
Oh yeah, I remember reading about that. Didn't he try to introduce a single god, the sun god Aten?
He did. Akhenaten was a fascinating and controversial figure. He shifted the focus away from the traditional pantheon of gods and elevated Aten to supreme status. It was a pretty radical move for a society that was so deeply rooted in polytheistic beliefs.
Did it stick?
Not really. After his death, there was a pretty swift return to the old ways. The pharaohs who followed Akhenaten even tried to erase his religious reforms from history, but thankfully, evidence of this period, known as the Amarna period, still exists.
So a bit of religious upheaval, but the new kingdom continued to flourish.
For a while, yes, but all empires faced challenges eventually. Egypt's wealth made it a target, and they had to deal with threats from the Libyans in the west and these mysterious sea peoples, possibly a coalition of seafaring raiders from somewhere in the Aegean region.
Sea peoples. That sounds almost mythical.
They do, don't they? We don't know exactly who they were or where they came from, but they seem to have caused significant disruption in the eastern Mediterranean around the 12th century BC.
Did they conquer Egypt?
Not completely, but they certainly contributed to a weakening of Egyptian power, along with internal problems like corruption and tomb robbing. It was the beginning of the end for the New Kingdom.
So what happened next? Did ancient Egypt just fade away?
Not at all. It entered a new phase called the Third Intermediate Period. It was marked by political fragmentation and the rise of new powers, including the Kushite civilization from Nubia, south of Egypt.
Nubia. That's modern-day Sudan, right?
Yes, the Kushites were really influenced by Egyptian culture, having been under their control for centuries. But now they were expanding their power north, and they even conquered Egypt, establishing a Kushite dynasty.
Wow, the student becomes the master. That's a twist.
It is, and they weren't just conquerors. The Kushite pharaohs embraced Egyptian traditions. They built their own temples and pyramids in the Egyptian style, and they considered themselves inheritors of the pharaonic legacy.
But their rule didn't last forever, did it?
No, they were eventually pushed back to Nubia by another rising power, the Assyrians from Mesopotamia. The Assyrians were a force to be reckoned with, and their conquest of Egypt marked another turning point.
So after the Kushites, it was the Assyrians calling the shots.
For a time, yes, but Egyptian resilience is a recurring theme throughout their history. Even under Assyrian rule, they managed to regain their independence for a period thanks to a new dynasty, the Saite kings.
The Said kings, were they like a comeback story?
You could say that. They were a native Egyptian dynasty, and they managed to shake off foreign rule and usher in a period of renewed prosperity and cultural revival.
Sounds like they were pretty savvy.
They were. One of the key factors in their success was their alliance with the Greeks, who were becoming a major power in the Mediterranean at this time. The Saipin kings even hired Greek mercenaries to form Egypt's first navy.
Your first navy. Wow, talk about a game
It
changer.
certainly was. But even the Say kings couldn't hold back the tide forever. Egypt was a coveted prize, and eventually another powerful empire came knocking, the Persians.
The Persians, famous for their vast empire and those epic battles with the Greeks.
Exactly. The Persian Empire under Cambyses II conquered Egypt in the 6th century BC, adding it to their already vast territory. It was the start of another period of foreign rule, though there were brief moments when they regained independence.
So after the Persians, what happened? Did ancient Egypt ever fully recover from this constant back and forth between empires?
That's where things get really interesting. The Persians were overthrown by a young Macedonian king who was about to change the course of history.
Wait a minute, Macedonian king. Are we talking about Alexander the Great?
The one and only. Alexander's conquest of Egypt in 332 BC ended Persian rule and brought about a new era, the Hellenistic period,
Hellenistic meaning.
influenced by Greek culture. Alexander, despite his short life, left an incredible mark on the world. His conquests spread Greek language, art, and ideas throughout the lands he conquered, including Egypt.
So did ancient Egypt essentially become a Greek colony?
Not exactly. See, Alexander died young, and his massive empire was divided among his generals. One of them, Ptolemy, established a Greek dynasty in Egypt known as the Ptolemaic Kingdom. They ruled for almost 300 years, blending Greek and Egyptian cultures in really fascinating ways.
So did they just start building Greek temples and statues all over Egypt?
They did build in the Greek style, especially in their new capital city, Alexandria, which became a hub of learning and culture. But they were also shrewd rulers. They understood the importance of respecting Egyptian traditions.
So a kind of cultural fusion was happening.
Precisely. The Ptolemies presented themselves as pharaohs. They supported traditional Egyptian religious practices, and they even built temples in the Egyptian style. It was a mix of Greek and Egyptian elements, creating a unique hybrid culture.
But this wasn't the final chapter for ancient Egypt, was it?
You're right. The Ptolemaic dynasty, despite its successes, eventually faced internal struggles and external pressures. A powerful republic to the west, with ambitions of conquest, was about to enter the scene.
And that would be, here we go again. Another empire wants control of Egypt. How did Rome manage to take down the Ptolemies, though?
Well, it wasn't a straightforward conquest. It involved political maneuvering, alliances, and ultimately a famous romance with a tragic end.
Okay, now you have to tell me more. This romance was it.
Between the last Ptolemaic ruler, Cleopatra VII, and the Roman general, Mark Antony.
Cleopatra. Now that's a name everyone knows. So what happened? Did love conquer all?
Sadly, no. Their affair and their alliance against another Roman general, Octavian, led to a clash of titans. The Battle of Actium, a naval battle off the coast of Greece, determined Egypt's fate.
And the winner was?
Octavian. Antony and Cleopatra were defeated, and in 30 BC, Egypt became a province of the Roman Empire.
So that was it, the end of ancient Egypt. 3,000 years of history absorbed by Rome.
In a way, yes. The era of the pharaohs was over, and Roman governors ruled Egypt. But Egyptian culture, their religion, their traditions, it didn't just vanish overnight. It persisted under Roman rule blending with Roman customs and beliefs. The story of ancient Egypt doesn't end abruptly. It transitions into a new phase, a fusion of cultures and identities. It reminds us that history isn't a simple straight line, but a complex web of interactions, influences, and adaptations.
Wow, what a journey. From the banks of the Nile to the rise and fall of empires, we've really explored the fascinating world of ancient Egypt. I'm so grateful for your insights. You've truly brought this civilization to life for us.
It's been my pleasure. Ancient Egypt, with all its complexity and lasting impact, never fails to amaze.
And for our listeners, I think we've given you a lot to ponder. If you're looking to go even deeper, I encourage you to look into the Kushite civilization. They adopted many aspects of ancient Egypt, including pyramid building, but they also developed their own unique culture and traditions. It's a fascinating story waiting to be discovered.
Excellent suggestion. The Kushites were a remarkable civilization in their own right, and their interactions with Egypt really highlight how interconnected cultures were in the ancient world.
So ancient Egypt under Roman rule. It's hard to imagine those iconic monuments, those majestic temples, under the control of a foreign power.
What was it like for the Egyptians during this time? So we left off with Egypt becoming a Roman province. What happened to Egyptian culture under Roman rule? Did they try to suppress it?
What's interesting, they didn't take a scorched earth approach.
Yeah.
Romans were pragmatic, I think. They wanted stability and resources more than anything, not cultural upheaval if they could avoid it.
So pay your taxes, keep the grain flowing, and you're good.
Pretty much, yeah. But there were these subtle shifts. Roman emperors, for example, never fully embraced the title of pharaoh. They lacked that divine connection, which Egyptians had associated with their rulers for millennia.
Makes sense. What about religion? Did the Romans force their gods on the Egyptians? Surprisingly, no. Early on, they were quite tolerant of different religions within the empire. They even adopted some Egyptian deities into their own pantheon. Like Isis, for example, became quite popular in Roman society.
So kind of a religious fusion then.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But then Christianity started spreading within the Roman Empire, and with Christianity's emphasis on one god, it really challenged traditional Egyptian beliefs.
So it was under Roman rule that Christianity was introduced to Egypt.
Yeah.
And eventually it just completely took over. That must have been a massive change.
It was, but a gradual one. As Christianity gained power, especially under emperors like Constantine, traditional Egyptian religious practices were kind of pushed aside. Temples closed, and the priesthood, which used to be so influential, lost its power.
It's like watching a slow-motion cultural makeover.
Hmm.
What about their language, their writing? Did those survive?
They did, in a way. People still spoke Egyptian, but hieroglyphic writing, it declined. It was mostly used by priests at that point. A simpler script, Demotic, became more common for everyday use.
So hieroglyphs, those amazing symbols that we associate with ancient Egypt, they started to fade away.
Sadly, yeah, it's kind of ironic. The symbols that were meant to ensure eternity were themselves lost for centuries. As the religious institutions declined, knowledge of hieroglyphs declined too.
Wow. What about Coptic? I've heard that term connected to ancient Egypt. What is that?
Well, Coptic is actually a later form of the Egyptian language. It's fascinating. It was written using a modified Greek alphabet. Coptic emerged during the Roman period and became the language of the Christian community in Egypt.
So it's kind of like a bridge between the language of the pharaohs and what people speak in Egypt today.
Exactly. Coptic retained elements of ancient Egyptian, but also incorporated Greek influences. It's a great example of how languages evolve and adapt over time, reflecting cultural shifts.
That is fascinating. So with this Roman period, we're at the end of our look at ancient Egypt. But what happened after Rome? Did Egypt just become another Roman province and kind of fade away?
No, not at all. The story definitely continues. But there are new influences and new challenges. The Roman Empire itself eventually split into eastern and western halves, and Egypt became part of the Eastern Roman Empire, also known as the Byzantine Empire.
Right, the Byzantines. Weren't they based in Constantinople?
They were. And under Byzantine rule, Christianity became even more established in Egypt, becoming the dominant religion. But the Byzantines had their own problems, you see, including a new rival out east.
Oh, let me guess. Another empire wanted a piece of Egypt.
You guessed it. The Sasanian Empire, from Persia, challenged the Byzantines for control of key regions, including Egypt. They even managed to conquer Egypt for a short time in the 7th century.
So Egypt was stuck in the middle again. It seems like it was always at the crossroads of history.
Oh, it absolutely was. But even after the Sasanians, another huge force was on the horizon. A new religion and a new empire that would completely reshape Egypt.
Are we talking about...
The rise of Islam. In the 7th century AD, Arab armies, inspired by this new faith, swept across North Africa. They conquered Egypt in 641 AD. This marked the end of Byzantine rule and the beginning of a new chapter in Egyptian history, a chapter profoundly shaped by Islamic culture and civilization.
So from Romans to Byzantines, with even a brief Persian interlude, Egypt became part of the Islamic world.
That's right. And while the Pharaonic era was long gone, their legacy was still there. The Islamic rulers of Egypt recognized the grandeur of the ancient civilization. They preserved its monuments and incorporated elements of its artistic traditions into their own architecture, actually.
It's really amazing how ancient Egypt, even in its decline, still had such a powerful influence on those who came after. What a testament to its lasting legacy.
Absolutely. And that legacy continues to fascinate us today. It inspires research, exploration, and a sense of wonder at the achievements of this incredible civilization.
Well, we have covered so much today, from the rise of the pharaohs to the arrival of Islam. It's been a whirlwind tour through, what, 3,000 years of history? What a fantastic journey.
It has been a true pleasure exploring this all with you. Ancient Egypt, its complexities and its enduring impact, it never ceases to amaze.
And to our listeners, if you're interested in exploring even further, I'd really encourage you to look into the Kushite civilization south of Egypt. They adopted many Egyptian practices, but also developed their own unique culture and traditions. It's a fascinating story waiting to be discovered.
I agree. The Kushites were incredible, and their story really shows how interconnected all of these cultures were in the ancient world.
Thank you all so much for joining us on this journey through ancient Egypt. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep that thirst for knowledge alive.